Thank you guys so much. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the effect of excess mortgage liabilities on household labor decisions. Okay, and so when I say excess here, I mean that the value of the house is less than the value of the liabilities against it. So in following the sort of massive house decline after the crisis, about 1 in 3 households with a mortgage had negative equity in that house. And at the same time, we saw a prolonged, significant decline in labor force participation and a rise in unemployment. A number of recent theory papers have suggested that maybe this relationship is causal, and it could be coming from a household debt overhang problem that's similar in some respects to the one that we think of for firms, where in the case of a household who's very indebted, they don't anticipate actually having to pay back the full amount of the mortgage, but the amount that they're going to have to pay back depends on their income. And so this income contingent renegotiation acts like an implicit tax that incentivizes them to reduce their labor supply. Okay? And if this is true, this could have important macroeconomic implications and say something about how we design mortgage assistance programs, but assistance programs in general, right? And what my paper does is it's the first empirical paper to actually document the effect of debt overhang on household labor decisions via this excess mortgage channel. Okay? One of the challenges with this is there are not a lot of public data sets that have information on household earnings and mortgage liabilities. So I teamed up with a major US financial institution who gave me all transaction level information for their clients from 2010 to 2014. So if they have a mortgage there, I see it. I see a credit card. I'll see all deposits into your checking or savings account. And critically, I use those deposit inflows as my measure of income. Okay? And what you're going to have as an issue here for causal interpretation is that you're going to have time-varying local demand shocks, right? So if the factory closes in your town, that's going to reduce house prices. It's also going to reduce employment. So I have to try and deal with that somehow. So what I do is I compare households who are in the same region at the same time, but they have different amounts of equity because they bought their house at different times. And so I'm going to exploit that as my plausible source of exogenous variation and see how that affects their labor supply decisions. Okay? And here are my big 3 takeaways. So I find that this instrumented negative home equity is associated with a 2 to 6% decline in household labor supply. It looks like it's coming along the extensive rather than intensive margin. That is to say they basically don't take a job as soon if they're unemployed, rather than coming via hours worked. And it looks like it's more prevalent in regions where there's more of these income contingent renegotiations or mortgage modification programs, consistent with it coming via that channel. Okay? So let me take a real quick step back and explain again what I mean by this household debt overhang. So imagine here in the baseline case you have a household who for simplicity earns nothing. They have a mortgage which they owe at the end of the year for $150,000, but the house price fell and so they only have a house worth $100,000. So they have $50,000 in negative equity. Okay? They go to the bank says, we don't want you to walk away from the mortgage, so you don't have to pay back the full $150,000, why don't you just pay us back $100,000? Everyone says, okay. Imagine the counterfactual world, which is in the take job case, where they take a job that year and earn $40,000. They go to the bank and say, look, I've got this job that's going to earn $40,000. The bank says, that's great. Could you pay us back $140,000 then? So you can see in this case they've actually relaxed the amount you owe still by $10,000, but every dollar you earned went to repay the bank, right? And so in this case you have an implicit tax rate of 100%. Every dollar you earn, you lose $1 in benefits. You don't have to have 100% implicit tax to see a response. It turns out in practice you do see taxes this size. So a lot of the national modification programs, for example, HAMP, you can go online at checkmympv.com. I put in a theoretical household. The household is underwater, so has negative equity. They owe about $1,500 per month in mortgage payments. Let's say they earn $48,000 that year. Well, they're eligible for $15,000 in reduced payments over the next 5 years. If instead you take the exact same house and they earn $54,000, so they work to earn an extra $6,000 that year, they only see $6,000 in reduced payments. So by earning an extra $6,000, they're actually losing $9,000 in benefits. And so when I talk about these tax rates, implicit tax rates in excess of 100%, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay? But the question is, empirically, do we see households responding to this? So the data they're going to use is pretty novel. So I ended up getting information on about some sort of information, whether it's credit card, mortgage, or deposit information on about 1 in 4 US households at a transaction level from 2010 to 2014. So a pretty cool data set. And what I do is I use deposit inflow. So what I have here is at the zip code level, I compare the deposit inflow measure that I use as an income measure with the IRS averages in those zip codes. And I have correlations about 80 to 90%, and you can even compare this at the individual household level, and they look very similar. So I'm relatively comfortable in this measure of an income proxy. The final sample, though, is going to be households who have deposits, so I can estimate income, and have a mortgage at this institution that lets me say they have negative equity. End up with about 200,000 households that meet all the criteria, or about 5.4 million household month observations. And it's nice that the final sample, the delinquency rates for that sample look similar to national delinquency rates, which gives me some comfort that the matching is going pretty well, and that I actually have some external validity from the conclusions of this study. Okay? So critically, what I do here is this causal interpretation is going to be key and kind of difficult to get at. So what I do is I compute what I call my synthetic loan-to-value measure. So what it is it's house price changes computed at an MSA level. Okay? And critically, whenever I do this, I'm going to have MSA cross-time fixed effects. So the source of variation that's driving this first term is going to be that I bought at a different time than you in that region, and that's why my house is worth more or less. Like critically, it doesn't depend on how much I put into the house in repairs or other things like that. Okay? And I'm going to do a few variations with just this piece. The other parts that I use is I'm going to use a synthetic loan amortization schedule. So I just assume you have a fixed rate mortgage and a 30-year term, and that's going to pay at a typical schedule. So don't actually use your prepayment. And then rather using your actual amount that you put down initially, I'm going to use just the median national loan to value for the cohort that you originate with. And sort of critically here, what I'm trying to take advantage of is try to compare households exposed to the same local demand shocks but have different amounts of equity based on when they moved. Right? And what that's going to look like in a two-stage procedure here is on the left-hand side, I'm going to have a dummy variable equal to 1 if you have negative home equity. The right-hand side, I'm going to have a dummy variable equal to 1 if your synthetic loan to value is greater than 100%. And then I'm going to have these region time fixed effects, so this is at the MSA level, and I'm going to have household fixed effects and then some household time varying controls. I'm going to use that predicted probability of negative equity in the second stage and see how that affects your deposit inflows. And that's going to be the main specification in this paper. Okay? And so what does this kind of look like? So as I increase your loan to value, what we see is anything greater than this has negative equity. You see these are the ones that are more likely to be delinquent on this mortgage. They're also the ones who are much more likely to receive these mortgage modifications. So if no one was getting mortgage modifications, even if the implicit tax was large, it wouldn't matter. But about 44% of households with negative equity who are at least 60 days delinquent get a modification within the next 2 years in my sample. And that's about you're about 21% more likely to get a mod if you have negative equity. So it's pretty prevalent. And when you look at the actual effects, so on the left-hand side here, I have the percent change in your deposit inflows, which is this measure of monthly earnings. And I have here loan-to-value buckets, and I have these region time fixed effects. And what you see is for low levels of loan-to-value, but large variations in the value of your house, you see nothing statistically significant in terms of changes in your income. But then if you have negative equity, you see this decline in basically your deposits, which I interpret as a decline in your labor supply. And sort of critically, this is kind of what I'm talking about when I say I'm getting these sort of large reductions in labor supply in response to having negative equity. Right? The problem here is I'm actually using loan to value. I'm not using that synthetic measure. I could rerun this where I have just the house price index changes, again with region time fixed effects, where the house price change is house price change in the MSA since you bought it. So what's driving, the only thing driving the source of variation here on the x-axis is, did I buy at a bad time relative to everyone else in the same region as me, right? And what you have here is these are positive changes and these are negative changes, and these are the deposit inflows here. And you see again that there's no change until you see these sort of large drops, which is what's driving basically the power behind the result I showed here, which is that these large declines are giving you negative equity, which is giving you these incentives to reduce your labor supply. Okay? And so when I estimate the coefficients, I get somewhere between in the two-stage procedure, I get somewhere between a 2 to 6% decline in household labor supply using this instrumented negative equity. And one way to think about it is in terms of an elasticity. So if we say that conditional on getting a modification, you're going to face a tax rate of about 100%, and you're 21% more likely to get a modification if you have negative equity, then you end up with an elasticity with respect to that tax of about 0.1 to 0.3. Okay? And relative to sort of the micro literature that we know from labor economics, we know that it's about 0.25 is the elasticity with respect to the explicit taxes, right? Which is sort of interesting because it looks like households responded to the implicit taxes here similarly to the way they do explicit taxes. And then, of course, they do a whole slew of robustness checks, and I might leave them for some of the questions to try to deal with time-varying cohort fixed effects, or is it just the case that people are moving their deposits out of this institution? And what you see is that if you just get rid of cases where it's a $0 inflow, it doesn't kill the results. But if instead of having this, I have a cutoff of greater than 25% decline, the results go away. And what that says is it's really coming from households who are making these large employment decisions. So this is not taking a job or you have a two-income household and one person doesn't work rather than hours worked. And then if I look at a proxy for getting Social Security, I see that you're more likely to get Social Security payments or disability payments if you have negative equity, which is another form of reducing your labor force participation and making an extensive margin decision that's reducing your labor supply, okay? And then I can also interact this with regions where modification rates are more prevalent. So if you look at regions of the country where you see mortgage modifications, you actually see a larger response to having negative equity. Again, consistent with it coming via this income contingent implicit tax channel. And this is true if I control for delinquency rates in those regions, or I do it relative to the percent who get a modification of those who are delinquent. And I can also just look in regions where they have judicial foreclosure requirements where you're more likely to get a modification because it's harder to foreclose on you, but the local demand shocks are lower, and you still see a slightly weaker, larger response to having negative equity. Again, consistent with it coming via this implicit tax channel, okay? And I'll try to keep this on time here, so I'll very briefly just say what I think about this, right, is that when I talk with the bank, right, a lot of the discussion has been given that households are responding to the implicit tax that you have in these programs, it should say something about how you design the program if you actually know that they're going to be responding to the incentives provided, right? So I've talked a lot with the bank, but I think the bigger picture here is that a lot of them are national programs, right? And so when you're designing national programs like HAMP or FDIC or the National Mortgage Settlement, you should be thinking about the household's response to the incentives of that program, in particular in terms of the labor supply response, not just for mortgage assistance, but in general for assistance programs and how likely households are to respond to implicit tax rates in general. And that's sort of the big takeaway, I would say, from my paper. But I think there's a lot of room still to do from a macro standpoint and in terms of thinking about how to optimally design these sort of mortgage assistance programs. So.